I'm here at the School of Historical Dress in South London, looking at some of the fantastic original pieces that they have in their archive from the late 18th and early 19th century, the Long Regency. And what I have on the table here is probably the garment that people most associate with this period, the little white dress or high-waisted muslin gown. But there's so much more to see in this dress than just a lightweight, flimsy piece of fashionable attire. So I want to go through it as I see it as a fashion historian who's been specializing in clothing of this period and show you what I see. First of all, this dress is made of muslin, which technically is a type of thread, but we more associate with the fabric. It's made of cotton and it's plain weave, it's lightweight, it's soft and clinging. And this fabric became increasingly popular in fashion from the 1780s, when, especially popularized by Marie Antoinette and her court, who started wearing chemise dresses, or dresses that looked like underwear, that was made of this soft cotton fabric rather than the expensive rich silks that they were expected to wear as court women. From there, muslin rose in popularity until it became one of the predominant fashion fabrics in the 1790s, and then through into the 1800s and the 1810s of the Regency period. This dress is from the late 18 teens or early 1820s and shows how this fabric remained popular, and it does through into the later 19th century. So there's a lot of different material characteristics that muslin has that contributes to Regency fashion at this point. First of all, it is very soft and very clinging and quite transparent. Therefore, you definitely need to wear petticoats underneath this. One of the great Regency fashion myths that's more associated with French style at this time is that women didn't wear petticoats and either went kind of naked or very scantily dressed under their clothes. And you can see that if you're wearing a muslin gown, you're going to get a lot of transparency underneath. But it's simply not true for the majority of women. It's like looking at 200 years in the future at what Kim Kardashian wore to the Met Ball and say that that's what women are wearing in everyday life. And when we look at the records and the text sources for this period, women, especially in Britain, who are more lightly dressed, attract ridicule and censure. Muslin is also, because it's a cotton fabric, it has a slight pile to it. It's very soft. And this means it kind of clings to itself. And if you're wearing petticoats underneath this as well, it has a sort of a static electricity property to it. And this is the source of, again, one of the most enduring myths about the Regency period, that women dampened their dresses in order to make them cling. And this idea, which I've seen in every possible form and in many academic sources, is based on a misreading of documentary sources. There's a number that say the dresses look as if they have been dampened because of the way that they clung to the body. But that's an appearance. It's not saying that they were dampened. And when you put on a muslin dress, especially if you're only wearing, say, one petticoat underneath, it does curve to the contours of the body, but that's through more static electricity than dampening a gown, which, if you think about it, the logistics of dampening a gown and keeping it dampened throughout an evening, especially when you're hot and dancing, it's highly impractical. So that's some of the material qualities of muslin. But what's really interesting about it is where it comes from, because muslin is one of the great traditional fabrics of Indian areas, especially Bengal. And it had been imported into Europe, well, for millennia, actually. The Romans used muslin. It was kind of as light as air, this miraculous fine fabric. But the popularity of muslin had grown, at least from the 17th century, with the imports, particularly from the British East India Company. And it was a kind of a fabric that was used in small areas, such as aprons or handkerchiefs to fill in necklines. As muslin grew in popularity for an outer fabric, the imports increased. But we have to think of this as a luxury import. This is coming from a long way away, and it's often very finely worked. So this muslin dress is tambour stitched with a pattern of leaves or grasses all over it, which is a huge amount of labor. And so although these new white muslin dresses were seen and are often still associated with a sort of, oh, an egalitarian simplicity and a return to democratic ideals, this is an expensive fabric that also requires a lot of upkeep to wear. So it's not just a plain white cotton dress, it's a luxurious import. But because of the nature of colonialism, when muslin comes into Britain, now we kind of see this as a typical Regency fabric, but at the time, the qualities of genuine Indian muslins were deeply appreciated. And so many of the decorative techniques that we associate with muslins now, so things being spotted or sprigged or having patterns woven into them, all of that technology and that decorative appeal comes from the original Indian weavers. But because of the popularity of muslin, this fabric also helps to drive the Industrial Revolution, which really picks up in Britain from the 1760s with inventions like the water wheel and the spinning jenny. And for British manufacturers, trying to compete with the quality of imported muslin was a huge driver to improve their technology. As Henry Tilney says in Jane Austen's novel Northanger Abbey, he talks about a true Indian muslin. And when muslins are being produced in Britain, particularly in northern England and Scotland, their quality is seen as not as good as the Indian ones. And what Britain is aiming to do is to reach a point, which happens probably in the sort of 1810s, where the British muslins can compete in quality with the Indian ones. And what this triggers is a series of punitive financial measures by the East India Company in India to kind of scupper the production of Indian muslin. And while muslin was still produced in India, it wasn't in the same quantities, and the art of making it has nearly been lost. There's a lot of work to revive that today, but it was the British competition that really undermined the market for this incredible fabric. And so again, while this is kind of seen as democratic and egalitarian, I mentioned the work that needs to be done to maintain it. In Pride and Prejudice, Lydia Bennet, when she runs off to marry Wickham, she talks about having a great slit in her muslin gown that needs to be fixed. And this is a delicate fabric. It tears, it spots. So this required quite an infrastructure of laundering to keep it looking fresh and white and keep it darned. So again, although it's sort of simplicity, it's still quite labor intensive, but it was washable. And this is one of the impacts of new cotton clothing and sort of the change in dominance from linen fabrics to cotton fabrics that appears in the late 18th century and continues through to the 19th. And as British textile technology improves, so does their global market share of especially cotton fabrics. And while old world cottons from India, there's different species for New World cottons. And the New World cottons, which are being grown in the Caribbean and in America, are often being worked by enslaved people. And the whole of Britain's dominance in the share of global cotton fabrics relies on unpaid, enforced labor to produce and pick the cotton that then is shipped into Britain, processed in the dark satanic mills, and then sent out worldwide. So in this simple white fabric, we can trace 100 years of industrial revolution, human oppression, exploitation, and global market forces that significantly change and shape the world around us. It's their textile and manufacturing dominance that is responsible a large part for the British Empire in the 19th century. So, in this sense, textiles remade the world. That's the really big picture of dress and why the history of clothing is so fascinating, because everybody wears clothes and textiles are one of the most ancient arts that are with us in every part of our life. So let's zoom back in a little bit and talk about this as a piece of fashionable dress. First of all, this is a genuine Indian muslin. And if you look at a lot of historical dress, you can really start to tell the difference between the British and the Indian muslin. And the Indian muslin is hand spun and hand woven. And when you look at it really closely, there's a slight unevenness to the weave that has a really beautiful texture to it and is a way that you can kind of identify an Indian muslin. British muslin, which is the thread is spun by machine and it's woven by machine, has far more regularity, but it loses a bit of its charm and interest in that way. But you can sort of tell the difference between them in archival collections. So this is a genuine Indian muslin, and it still has the embroidery or the tambouring worked into the fabric of it. There's lots of different qualities of muslin at this point as well, and whether they are woven with designs or embroidered during the weaving process or embroidered afterwards, we think of this perhaps now as just decoration, but it's huge amounts of human labor. Somebody somewhere, usually a woman, is picking up a needle and taking every one of these stitches by hand. So although it's white on white, it's not particularly flashy, it's not some splendid portmanteau with gold spangles and brocading on it, it still represents a huge amount of human work. What we start to see, especially in these later 1810s, is a move more towards gauzes and nets with decoration applied on them. And these kind of muslins have the kind of the labor value embedded into them as the fabric. So the fabric itself often retains its value as a piece of fabric. And if your beautiful muslin evening dress started to get a bit torn and a bit ripped, you could then maybe make it a day dress, or you could start to cut it down and use it for an apron or a handkerchief. And again, as Henry Tilney says, that muslin can always be turned to something or other. So this fabric in itself has value that people would then use and reuse in all sorts of ways. That's some of the bigger picture global context of muslin. But this dress is also useful for showing some of the characteristics of Regency dress in general. If muslin or a kind of a white gown is one of the defining images, this high waistline that comes up underneath the bust is probably the single most defining feature of women's dress in this period. The waistline rises in the mid-1790s, and it doesn't really start to fully drop back again to the natural waistline until the late 1820s. And so the waistline itself would sit underneath the bust, but how high or low your bodice was a matter of taste. And it was actually called high or low. If your gown came up to your neck, it was a high gown, and then you could have a low gown. And it's the same at the back. You could have high backs and low backs. This dress also has a drawstring that runs all the way around the neckline and makes it adjustable. So you can make this fit as you want, tighter, looser, and it's part of that kind of modular nature of Regency fashion. The sleeves are quite puffed and full. This has tissue paper in them for storage, but it gives you some idea of the volume, which is also a way of dating this dress to the later 1810s or early 1820s, because women's sleeve head volume rapidly increases in scale through the 1820s. And at the edge of the sleeve, we also have another drawstring that makes it adjustable around the arm. This dress is also back opening, which by this point has become normal, but it's a real change, moving the openings from always being at the front to the back. It's 180 degrees in about 20 years there as well. And one of the things about the white muslin dress is It was often discussed in terms of its relationship with antiquity, so the cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and to a lesser extent, ancient Egypt. And there was a lot of discourse around antiquity, not only its aesthetics and its styles and its art, but also supposedly around its ideals. So there's a huge impact of classicism in this period. Often when people now are talking about the Regency period, they describe it as neoclassical. But that term didn't come about until the 1880s and was actually a term of disapproval about this period, that it was kind of a fakery of the classical period. This high waistline now in fashion is called an empire line. In America, you tend to pronounce it empire in the French way, and this relates back to Napoleon's French Empire that is so dominant on the continent. But this concept of an empire line gown was never what they called it at the time. An empire line or a directoire line gown really comes about in about 1907 from French fashion designers. Looking back on this earlier period, the directory or directoire, the empire empire, and using that influence of these kind of dresses in their work. So it's anachronistic to call this dress an empire line gown in the period. But they didn't actually have a name for it. It was just the correct taste or the prevailing style. And they just talk about it in terms of waists are a little lower or a little higher. So there's no specific name for this at the time. And while muslin really did give people women sort of the opportunity to play statues, as it were, and kind of imitate these classical ideals of light flowing drapery that relates more to the body as it is without the structuring pieces of 18th century dress. There's another possibility to consider for this too. Indian muslin came from areas where, if you look around the world, the only place where high waisted garments are being worn by both men and women is also Indian areas. And I found a couple of references from the Regency period that talk about Indian dress as actually being the inspiration for the high waist. And you can see the correspondence between these high waisted dresses and especially Mughal styles in the middle of India around Delhi. So it could be that even this classic high waistline that so defines the period is also an import from India. Other elements of fashion at this time that have become iconic or completely representative of Regency fashion include the shawl, which comes from Kashmir, and again was Indian import shawls were so popular that European manufacturers quickly tried to imitate them. This worked especially well in Britain, where in places where they already had experience of working with wools, especially in the town of Paisley in Scotland. And the classic bote motif from Kashmiri shawls, which in itself comes from Persian depictions of a cypress tree, has become more popularly known since then as a Paisley pattern. But it's an erasure of the origins of where it came from. There's also a strong possibility that the reason that Regency women's shoes lose their heel is that they're also inspired by Indian dress. But I'm just conjecturing that at the moment. I don't have any historical evidence for it. Regency fashion is also often perceived as very, very pale and pretty. But this isn't necessarily how it would have been seen at the time. I'm showing you a white dress with white embroidery on white tissue paper and a white table in a white room. But if you look at fashion plates of the time or imagery, we see that white is being used as a neutral, and often women would accessorize everything else in bright color. So there's tons of fashion plates that have things like a white muslin dress with a red spencer or short jacket, lavender colored gloves, a lavender and red bonnet, and lavender colored boots. So this kind of provided a ground for accessorization. And there's lots and lots of bright colors that were used. I mean, pastels were popular, but I think also our perception of the paleness of the Regency period also comes from the watercolor washes that are used in fashion plates. They're not intense pigmentation, so it sort of conveys a pastel pretty look. And looking at historical objects and things like oil paintings give us a different view. And there's lots of beautiful deep velvet colors and plums and emerald greens. And in the silks, you have vivid yellows, kind of egg yolk yellows and apple greens and intense ultramarine blues and purples too. And I think sometimes there's a perception that the world doesn't get technicolor, as it were, until the invention of synthetic dyes in 1856. But I can assure you that Regency women had a lot of access to bright, vivid, fun colors, and they're definitely using them in their clothing. Muslins could also come in themselves in different colors. There's lots and lots of records in all sorts of documentary forms about the white muslins that are embroidered with colors. Jane Austen had a red spotted muslin. And there's also beautiful examples in many, many collections of what were called silver or gilt muslins, where they're actually woven in or embroidered with metallic threads. So you'd have a beautiful contrast between the soft cotton gown and this glittering, sparkling metallic thread in gold or silver that would really catch the light in, especially with the candles in the evening. But muslins took dye really well. So you could have pink muslins and green muslins, and there's lots of examples of those in museums and collections too. So even this kind of classic white fabric didn't itself have to be white.